Okay, thanks everyone for coming today. It's a pleasure to see so many friendly faces in the crowd coming, and it's a privilege to be here today with Megan and Sam. So this book is a census. It's a census bibliography of the first 10 editions of Hugo Grotius' iure, belli, pacis. This might sound dry as a bone, and I have 10 minutes to convince you that it's not. And that it will be helpful if you're studying law, politics, or economics, or books in general. So Hugo Grotius is widely known as the founder of international law, and I'm sure that we might get into that question today. But how did Grotius' international law go global? That was the premise of the project that led to this book. And the goal of this book was to draw on book history, so literally study the production and the circulation of a book to explain how international law was first sketched out in said book, and then to explore how this book circulated, so how international law went global. And another way of thinking about it is the title of this presentation, which is to think about the sort of scattering of Grotius's writings. A process which is also reflected in the book itself. So my goal today is to introduce you to the origins, the uses, and the challenges posed by a census of this kind, which is slated to appear in 2025 as part of a broader series of events celebrating the 400th anniversary of the publication of the book in 1625. And a question might one might reasonably wonder why publish such a book in 2025, precisely when international law, according to many, is on the wane, or certainly under challenge. And here,
Sorry, interrupt your flow.
No, it's fine. Yeah. So here we might consider the last effort that was carried out to do something like this, which was accompanied by the whistling screams of V-bombs falling on The Hague. And this was sort of background music to the last effort to create a census of Grotius's works, which was carried out during World War II, when two Dutch scholars, Jacob ter Meulen, and who was then the librarian of the Peace Palace Library in The Hague, and who had written a very long doctoral dissertation on Iranic thought, and Pieter Donaldson, sorry if anyone's Dutch, I've never been able to master Dutch, then a volunteer librarian, set out to carry out a study of the reception of Grotius's works. So as the Nazis occupied the Peace Palace in The Hague, now home to the International Court of Justice and the Permanent Court of Arbitration, Meulen registered his complaints about the poor borrowing practices of German officers, and things took a turn for the worse when both the Peace Palace and his own home were bombed by the Germans. So it's hardly surprising that against this background, when Meulen asked the Dutch government whether they would be interested in celebrating the anniversary of Grotius's death in 1645, the Dutch government showed little interest in it and said these were not auspicious times to sort of celebrate international law. So this is not the first time, really, that people have thought about turning to Grotius during times of escalation and conflict. What's most striking is that the book that you see on the screen, the Bibliographie des écrits imprimés de Grotius, is the text that up until now, and to this day, continues to be the leading text for Grotiana, and remains the main text on the publication history, the production, and the publication history of Grotius's works. So when approaching, in the age of the internet and big data, a much smaller scale project to do with one book only, we realized we were standing on the shoulders of giants, but we also thought we ought to be able to do better than they could. And during one of the visits to the Peace Palace Library, we actually went into the archives, and we found that there were a bunch of cigar boxes. And we asked the librarians what these were, and it turned out that it was the correspondence and all the annotations by Meulen and Donaldson, And it was a very humane story, really, because in the middle of the interwar period and then during the war, these men had managed to correspond with scholars across the world to understand very tricky things to figure out even to this day. So when, for instance, when a given branch of the Inquisition censored what work of Grotius is. And so again, you know, in the age of big data with the internet and extensive funding from the German Research Foundation, we thought we ought to do better. And so we tried our best with the time that we had and with the constraints posed by COVID at the very beginning of the project. So what did the book find? Sorry, just... Yeah. Okay. So one thing that we found is that, so first of all, there's a question of volume and there's a question of the author. Scholars used to think that there were 100 copies of the text around the world, and we found close to 1,000. But we also found a very different Grotius than the one traditionally known. We knew he was a restless soul, but the man would not stop editing his writings, which is a very common thing if you're an academic. But this was, with Grotius, it was slightly ridiculous. So we found that in writing the first edition of the text in 1625, there were actually three variants, so three states, as known in the book history literature of this edition. The first one just featured terrible mistakes, including the line that God denied rather than bequeathed peace between Christians. And this was all because Grotius was in a rush to make the Frankfurt Fair, book fair. And in 1631, to our shock, we found that Grotius made over 1,000 edits to the text. And if any entrepreneurial grad student would like to take this on, you know, that's about 3 years of work, if done well. So that's plenty for a PhD. What I can say is sort of the most striking changes to the text were in the prolegomena, where Grotius introduced a reference to divine laws among the sources of international law, in addition to custom, nature, and pacts. In book 2, he developed a section on arbitration, and in book 3, he added a paragraph on deceit during war. In 1642, Grotius again changed the book. In this case, he harnessed the prestige of the book in order to use this publication to intervene in a confessional debate. And this was the discovery of my former colleague, Tim Twining, who made this amazing finding where he realized that there was a commentary on the letter to Philemon attached to this edition of the 1642 and traced the sort of intellectual history of how this was part of a broader challenge that Grotius was hoping to address. A second general theme that emerges from this book, and we tend to think of these authors as being sort of hegemonic, as being able to do whatever they wanted with the text. Nothing could be further from the truth. Printers, as we studied sort of pricing, binding, printing, what books were bound with this one, it turned out that printers did whatever they wanted with this book. We have to remember this is an age before copyright, and here we drew extensively on the research by Andrew Pettigrew, who's done great stuff on book history. And what's clear is that rulers granted a license to print a given book, and this was known as a sort of privilege. And this did not stop piracy. I mean, competition was fierce, and piracy was rife. If anything, it seems to have sort of incentivized it. So the first publisher was Nicholas Bourne, based in Paris, and he simply refused to publish the second edition of the text, even though it sold out. So Grotius was quite happy when a pirated version appeared in Frankfurt the following year. And in 1631, he published and revised the text, as we've heard. But we think that part of the desire behind the publication that year was also the printer's keenness to become the official printer for the Dutch East India Company. And the next year, to the surprise of both Grotius and William Blau, the printer of this edition, a cheap edition appeared by the printer who was literally just down the road from where Blau worked. and it included a copy of Mare Liberum attached to it, so another one of Grotius' key works. This has been interpreted in the literature as meaning as meaning that Grotius took a turn in his thinking, but actually it turns out it was just the publisher who was hoping to outcompete Blau. And so Grotius' works have become ensnared within this commercial war between these two printers in Amsterdam, which is something that quite striking. And of course, this is in huge contrast to Grotius' commentary on Aristotle's story about Thales and the vices of monopoly, which seems quite quaint alongside these commercial pursuits. If you don't know about the story, Google it. This is good, and we need to think about these problems in this day and age. And the story of Thales is very, very good. So I'm happy to speak a little bit about the reception of the text. Other authors with books like this would have focused either on the production or on the reception of the text. Did both. We can talk a little bit about how the writings inform debates about slavery, why the book goes into case law, why the Catholics read Grotius, and all the rest. But I think it's more important, particularly since we have young people in the audience, to explain how to use a book like this. So before Control F existed, there were indices, and there's still indices at the back of books. And while we were doing a workshop on this book, Hans Blom said the index of this book is going to be the most important part of this book. So we have 4 different indices. One is a general index. Naturally, Sam has already found a problem with one of them, even before we started. But one is a general index. The other one is an owner's index. Then there's a location index, and then there's a pre-1700 location index. This elicited much debate within the project, which is mostly made up of the locations where the books resided before they were incorporated into modern libraries. Many of these were in France, in convents and abbeys, and we have information about where they were thanks to the revolutionary confiscations during the French Revolution. The end of the book features a desiderata, so what other people can do with this. Again, this is meant to be a manual. To Megan's point, this is more of a manual. This is the handbook. This is something that is meant to be used in a library. And again, you're meant to go back, look at the index, and look at whatever random thing it is you're looking at. And they might be here, might not be here. And just sort of take it from there. So before we go into the discussion, I just want to sort of talk a little bit about what I learned about Grotius in doing this, and go back to sort of what we can do about the history of international law today, and studying it through book history and through a census like this. Grotius, there's no doubt he was a polymath, a diplomat. He was also a pedant who made the faux pas of advising a widowed queen to have children to resolve her political dilemmas, not once, but twice. And he was also a celebrity who had fans waiting at ports in Sweden, waiting for him to arrive in order to sign copies of the book. But I think the main thing to take from him is that he was someone writing in political exile. He barely escaped the plague right before writing the Iure Belli. And he encouraged diplomats to distrust received wisdom and reminded statesmen that promises like security guarantees are at the heart of international law. So when thinking about reforming international law, thinking about the history of international law, it's worth just thinking about what he actually did, his words, his actions, and ignoring the sort of myth that there is around Grotius. If Grotius could write such a text in such dire circumstances, we ought to be able to reform international law by pursuing the same spirit and determination. As a sort of provocation, perhaps it's worth saying that I think there's a bit of a problem with Grotius in the field of international law, in that there is the constant appeal to his authority to vindicate its legitimacy. And too often, a lot of international lawyers will appeal to this inherited tradition or this invented tradition to legitimate international law. And I think it's worth thinking about what international law looks like if we can't just appeal to this man who is much more than just an international lawyer. I would really invite people, doing histories of ideas, economic history, or different disciplines to actually tackle the history of international law, because it's a really important subject. And I think it really would benefit from more interdisciplinarity. So in that spirit, I'm really looking forward to the comments of both respondents in this panel. Thank you for your attention.
Terrific, thanks, Ed. And just to say to those online that if you want to put questions in the Q&A that you want me to ask on your behalf, or if you want to signal interest in asking a question, you can do so from now. But I'm going to hand over, before we get to that point, to Samuel Garrett. Sam, take it away.
So in the first instance, congratulations. It is a pleasure to join Edward Jones Corredera and Megan Donaldson to discuss this book, The Unseen History of International Law, which is a commendable work of scholarship, newly and finally published by Oxford University Press, and undertaking the endeavor of a global census of, I count 9, maybe I'm miscounting to 9. The first 9 editions, including the pirated editions, 1625, 1626, 1631, both editions of 1632, 1642, 1646, 1647, and 1650 of Hugo Grotius's On the Law of War and Peace, or On the Right of War and Peace. There is no paucity of smart material to discuss in this book. According to Mark Somos, after Copernicus, Shakespeare's first folio, and Vesalius, this is the 4th global census, at least in English, of this kind, and the second such project undertaken with Somos as part of the research team. The volume is divided into 3 parts. And they're, in a way, they could each be a book. Each of the in effect is kind of 3 different books in a way, divided into 3 parts. Each part is separately organized internally by the 9 editions. So the editions actually structure each part of the book separately. Each of the 9 editions covered in the census. The first part treats the writing and printing of the book in each of the different editions from the vantage of the author and from the vantage of the publishers. The second part treats the ownership and readership of the different editions from the vantage of readers and book buyers. And then it's also internally organized via the editions. And the third part, also organized via the editions, offers the census of more than 900, the more than 900 surviving copies, or between 900 and 1,000 copies spread across the globe. So in conversation with one of the main authors of this study, I've been asked to pose a few questions to open up the conversation before turning things over to you, the audience, to ask better questions. In the series editor's introduction, Benjamin Straumann refers to Grotius, and I suppose we're in a kind of Benthamite context, we're in Bentham House, refers to Grotius as a proto-international lawyer, and describes the book as treating the early history of what is now called international law. The authors themselves reiterate this theme near the end of the conclusion to part 2 of the work, raising the question of when international law as the discipline and profession really took shape. So I suppose it's a question for all of us. To what extent is international law itself a kind of Benthamite coinage, right? Is it Bentham that gives voice to that concept of that term? When does international law become international law? Because it seems like, you can think of Grotius as the founder of international law, but you could also think of Gentili, you could think of Vittoria, you could think of papal encyclicals as founding international law. To what extent can we tell the history, the unseen history of international law through a kind of reception history of Grotius? Maybe we can. Maybe there are then also limitations to that. How should one situate, this is kind of a separate question, how should one situate the intervention of this volume methodologically? For instance, to what extent has the volume succeeded in displaying what we might call influence, right? Now, Quentin Skinner famously hostile or dubious of the concept of influence, and Straumann, but also to some extent Somos and frame the intervention methodologically as a kind of anti-Skinner intervention. Now, Skinner kind of raises the bar both in a past and present article and in the history and theory article from the 1960s, according to which showing or proving influence in intellectual history, we might say, is understood in some sense as contouring an author's intentionality, is almost raised to the point of non-demonstrability. And to what extent has this volume in a way overcome that hurdle, or has Skinner just cut the cut the categories in such a way that you actually can't show it, even if you should have something kind of as awesome as this book. And this seems like a rich and kind of fecund project, and it also seems for you and also for other contributors to have fed into other projects that you've completed recently, such as your recent book on odious debt, article in English Historical Review, as well as the forthcoming volume on the Spanish Empire, including and then another book beyond that. To what extent did this work actually shape, or actually help, even if this isn't really a book about the Spanish Empire, but although Spain comes into it, and also Spanish censorship of Grotius that also comes into the book in an important way. To what extent did your work on this project feed into your flourishing productivity in the other areas of scholarship? And to what extent can somehow working on Grotius then actually help thinking about the Spanish Empire, even if it's both part of the story but also off center? So that maybe also kind of question about intellectual creativity. Also a Bentham question on page 237 of the volume. Given that we are in the home of the great Bentham project, there is a kind of comparison between the work undertaken in this volume and that of the Bentham project, perhaps the longest continuously running editorial project in political philosophy and Anglophone scholarship. Perhaps in light of local interest, you might shed further light on that comparison. What can the Bentham project gain from this, and how might one put those projects in parallel? All of the authors of this book acknowledge that this is a work of many hands. And you mentioned Tim Twining, but you could also mention Jonathan Nathan, Francesca Urlato. And I suppose one question is about sharing and dividing credit for shared intellectual labor. So in terms of when there is a kind of group project like this, multiple authorship, how does one share the credit for that kind of intellectual work? This book appears, as you mentioned, in the 400th anniversary year of the first edition of Grotius's De Iure Belli Pacis. Are anniversaries in the history of thought happy coincidences, or do they have a deeper significance? Maybe leave it there and open it to better questions.
So I think in view of how much Sam has put on the table, I won't burden you with a full list of questions from a public international lawyer's perspective, but let me just make a couple of comments about why I think the book is interesting and provocative for this intersection between international law and history. So the first point is about the identification of custom. So, this is a term which is current to Grotius, as you mentioned, when he added divine law in the Prolegomena in the 1631 edition, he was adding it to a list which already featured custom, nature, and pacts. So he's working between different traditions and trying to forge something which, to be honest, is recognizable to modern public international lawyers as a, understanding of where law comes from still. This word custom, though, is a really interesting and rich one. One of, I think, the most generative ways the book might be used for research is, as Edward indicated, to pick up the indices and work with the indices, look at locations, look at people, look at places. But there's also rich work in this volume on annotations and what we might do with annotations to the various editions of Grotius. So what people wrote in the margins. And many of the people who were annotating the work were people who had intellectual heft, who had influence in diplomacy and politics, and, in law, the way that law took shape, the way people thought normatively about a lot of the different practices which were shaping their kind of commercial world, world of empire. If you were interested in a particular area of law, what it's possible to do now with this book is go through and trace which parts of the various editions have been annotated. And you can then get a sense of if there are particular parts dealing with particular themes or questions, how heavily they attracted the interest of annotators, and then you could actually go and, providing you can actually get access to the annotations, get a sense of what these different people said. The book has an interesting chapter on slavery, which models exactly that practice, but you could also do it for many other themes. And the way it's framed in the volume is that this offers us the prospect of spotting what's called the crystallization of new customs, right? The moment in which something moves from what is being done to something which has normative significance, right? It exists as a norm, it has a legal significance. And that's, I think, very interesting historically, tracing the way in which law evolves, but it's provocative intellectually as well for how we think historically about custom. Because one thing that we don't have, I don't think, is much work on a temporally and contextually sensitive understanding of custom. And certainly there's a sort of practice in legal argument today, even work that's quite historically oriented, of saying the custom at X point in time was whatever. And often that's a retrojection of what we understand now by custom, which is it's very connected or very oriented towards the practice of individuals who held offices of state who spoke for the state or who held briefs, who represented clients in particular negotiations or sort of disputations. I'm not sure that's actually the way to think about custom in an earlier period. So I think that there's an interesting and generative avenue to go down there, not only using the kind of foundations which are provided by the volume, but taking that as provocation to think, how do we relate these intellectual practices of not only purchasing and reading and annotating, but also book collecting, which becomes an antiquarian practice at some point, as the volume points out. How do we relate that to what I think is often treated as a narrower practice of disputation, argumentation, which has some anchoring in a kind of state or a polity? So that's the first comment. The second is to take up Ed's invitation to think about what work Grotius does for the discipline of international law today. There is a sense in which he's still a figure who is appealed to, invoked, cited, sometimes as the father of international law, although I think generally today that would have quite a dated feel to it, quite an antiquarian feel to it. I think it would be difficult to find lawyers who necessarily take that seriously as implying something about, you know, the normative value of any proposition drawn from his work. But there's two ways in which you do see Grotius invoked, which I think do have a lasting influence. One is the kind of tradition of identifying Grotian moments, which there's a whole body of articles and special editions of Grotiana which pursue this coming out of the project. And the other is a kind of Grotian style. And what do we mean by that? So if we talk about Grotian moments in international law, I guess stereotypically we're talking about moments in which things come together. When you're dealing with a customary system of law, you're dealing with what people do, what polities do. At some point, very hard to determine, and we're talking in quite mystical terms here, that does something, that crystallizes or that shapes or that tips over a threshold into having normative significance. And the difficulty of specifying more clearly what's going on in those moments is part of why custom is such an elusive form of law. But we still today talk about the idea of Grotian moments, and it's a very influential idea in international law that there can be particular moments in time or particular sequences of events in which things come together, if I can put it in those terms. We see the world differently. We judge differently. We invoke norms with different emphasis to the way that we might have done a month ago, a year ago. And I do think that that has some enduring influence in international law discourse, if not in the rules itself, right? How international lawyers think about responding to the world. It's related also to this question of Grotian style. So, you know, if you put me on the spot to say, what is the Grotian style? I think it is a sort of a reactiveness to events, an ability to synthesize. There's a peacemaking and ironic quality to it of bringing traditions together and negotiating between them, working at levels of abstraction that move to detail. That there's something there which I think is quite hard to define, but again, it's part of the self-identity, I think, of many international lawyers, that that's your vocation in the world. You respond to events and you work on them intellectually in this sensibility of kind of gathering and translation and working between the abstract and the detail. So I think there's actually a lot of thinking to do about Grotius's influence, but it's really not a question of Grotius the man. It's not a question of invocation of particular maxims. It's how has this identity become a carrier for all these complex questions about what is our professional identity, particularly at moments of crisis, I think, which is not far from our minds today. So let me give you a few minutes to respond and say anything that you want to in response to Sam or I, but you don't have to answer everything, and then let's open the floor.
That's great. Thank you so much, Sam. Okay, so let's start at the end. So in the 1970s, in the history of science, an idea was coined, which is the idea of a paradigm shift. And it was immediately panned by historians of science, and it was immediately adopted in the public sphere. This is when the idea of this Grotian moment came up as an idea of a theory, as a theory of historical change. And this, it was Keith Tribe, who's an economic historian, who drew my attention to this. The reason why I mention this is because when thinking about historical change, we tend to draw on analogies from other fields. And so one of the criticisms of the idea of the paradigm shift in the history of science was that this is just not how scientific change happens, right? And when thinking about crisis points, when thinking about analogies of war, when thinking about analogies of sudden changes, we need to be alert to how history actually does change and what type of framework we're imposing on things. So this project has really been an effort to understand how we think about history today. And so I'll start with your question, Sam, in that regard. So on the point of method and sort of the point about Skinner, so I actually see Grotius as a bit of a tragic figure. So Grotius is a myth in spite of himself. Grotius is someone who writes this. I mean, 1613, he goes to a diplomatic negotiation with English diplomats, and they throw a book that he's written at him. They throw Mare Liberum at him, and they say, what you're arguing in this diplomatic negotiation is actually against what you said in this text. In 1625, he publishes this book, but he is still, unable to go back to the Netherlands. And so he sees Swedish kings, he sees Richelieu, he sees all of these figures using his work, right? Using this thing that a lot of people immediately see as something akin to a law of nations, a law that might mediate relations between nations straight away. But he doesn't enjoy any of the benefits of this. I mean, he dies embittered. He thinks his children are a failure, thinks they've underperformed. At one point, he's the Swedish ambassador in Paris. I mean, what does that even mean to a man like him? And so I think he's quite a strange figure in the canon, in that he loses control and agency over his works. So the influence in many ways happens in spite of himself. And that challenges ideas about who the author is, not in the French critical tradition, but I mean more in the sense of how much it is the author who is driving the impact of his or her work. And in this case, different people read different things in Grotius. And my favorite anecdote is a bit ridiculous, but the Spanish and a lot of Catholics think that they can read him because they assume that because he died in France, which is a Catholic country, he must have converted at some point into Catholicism, and so they start quoting Grotius at will, not seeing any issues there, right? So there's a difference here between what the author states, how that author is read, and the influence it can have. I think the annotations give a different insight into how influence can take place. I was at the Bodleian at the first year of the project, and the most heavily annotated copy of that we found in the first few years is in the Bodleian, and it comes from a tiny abbey outside of Oxford. And it's one of these things of, if a tree falls in the woods and no one hears it, does it count? I mean, what do we do with a heavily annotated copy from a monastery that may not have left that monastery? What do we do? Is that what type of reception is that, right? So I don't take the project or the book as putting forward any prescriptive or normative claim as to method. Certainly thrives on volume, and it thrives on quantity over theory, I suppose. To your point about this being a multi-authored project, there were other ways of framing this. Could have gone narrower, like we were talking before the session. There was one idea of doing just the 1625 edition, since the anniversary was of the 1625 editions. Just looking at that, that's a story about France, really. It's a story about how the copies made their way around France. It looks very different than trying to do 10 different editions. There was that dispute over whether the 1647 is an edition or not. It's technically a reissuing of the 1631. I find it's neat to just say 10 editions. And so yeah, I guess I wouldn't take any I hadn't thought about sort of the implications that it might have for ideas of influence. And I would just hope that, you know, these comments on the author and the limits of the author's capacity and intentions themselves in relation to grocers can address that point. There was this broader question on Bentham and you know who's the sort of father, you know, who coined the idea of international law. So Martin van Ittersen has recently written about 1899 and basically how it looks like it was very so it was an American project in 1899 around the Hague conferences that really put grocers on the map as the father of international law by people who a few decades later, like Scott, would later say that Vittorio was the founding father of international law. And when you go to the Peace Palace Library today, you're met with a really strange room which is celebrates grocers and is full of teacups and really sort of middlebrow pottery about grocers. And then in the corner there is Andrew Carnegie's check for 1.5 million to set up the library. And so the sort of the iron fist of American power covered with the glove of grocers really is what comes through. And you know, I'm sort of going through a reconsideration of you know who is the real father, the man who coined this stuff. Because if you read the literature on American international law, everyone writing about American international law will tell you that it comes from common law, comes from Blackstone, and it has very different understanding of what custom and even precedent means for the United States. And so if you read someone like Oscanio, for instance, the US is there, but the unevenness of a global order that features a power like the US being there is not. And the influence of the US in crafting the European-centric framework of the Hague is not there. And so we're missing that sort of theory of power within the history of international law. And I suspect if you went down that road, you'd get to a better question around this question of Bentham or grocers. In terms of the Bentham project, I mean, you know, we really learned a lot from it. We really hope to share as much as you share with the public, but we were met with constraints around sort of copyright to do with the images. I mean, digital humanities is a booming field, and one of the dreams which was suggested to us by a team of filmmakers in Berlin was to make a database where you could just have all of the annotations appear. And so a sort of viewer or reader would be able to sort of scour the different annotations and search, and there would be a sort of database. But you have to choose. You have to choose where you go with this. And we chose a more traditional analog model. I don't want to go on for too long. I'm sure I've left out one of Sam's questions, and I haven't even Megan really properly. But perhaps we can sort of lay some of the response into some of the questions, if that's okay.
Okay, so the floor is open for both those online and those here in the room. Sorry, go ahead.
So I'm going to pick up on that Megan mentioned about how the book kind of gives lawyers and researchers opportunity to trade by custom. This slide improves, I guess, normative. I wonder on the flip side of that, is there scope for taking the book, and I guess in particular the annotations in the books, the jumping off point for tracing where certain ideas, if not how these we should look at the fixed, say on the SCMT around even the Mari, for instance, are in fact fundamentally contested or kind of renegotiated over the course of subsequent editions. And I guess is there scope on the back of that to envision, I guess, alternative possibilities for how certain measures that evolved in the wake of that have come to evolve and how they could evolve in the future.
Go ahead. I'll take a cue, so go ahead with that one.
Yeah, so this is why this book is really a book about history, because you need book history, you need economic history, because we looked at pricing, the pricing of the original copies, you need intellectual history, you need whatever, history of international law. And I say this because annotations themselves are really annoyingly difficult to trace to a specific owner. I mean, you might find a copy that so one trend was that, you know, this is a text that is banned in many areas of Europe, and so you have someone writing these really erudite comments on the side, and sort of comparing the ideas to, you know, drawing Aristotle and Augustine, all this stuff, and then you have a bored 18th century aristocratic student sort of making drawings on the side, because most student copies that we found did not get past book one. So yes, in an ideal world, if we had more time, that would be a wonderful way to pursue that research, to study customs through literally how these readers engage with the text. I mean, the most striking one was one that we found a copy by Wendell Phillips, who's an abolitionist, and there we were able to track down the references to fugitive slaves and free wills and testaments. And this was in the context, so Phillips was using this in the context of abolitionist debates in America. So that was that kind of the best example of that. You know, if all the copies were like that, where you had the name at the beginning, the date, and that kind of richness, that would be the dream. But you might be able to find it if you spent 30 years like Mueller and Johansson did, and what a dream that would be. But it's a very exacting method. Yeah.
So I think Chris next on the line.
So 3 quick questions, each in a different kind of register. The first one is to go back to the issue you touched on at the end, where you suggested you might have done a database, but you did a book. And I kind of want to press you on that, because what you're talking about is so obviously well suited to some kind of sophisticated online presentation, given all the you talk about big data, but also the way you're amassing so much information and connecting it up among one another. There's always going to be a sense that a book, however well indexed, is going to be clunkier than a kind of online interface organized around hypertext links. And I often have, thinking about great early modern works, I often think the version of that, or, you know, Bale's dictionary was kind of optimized for the World Wide Web, except Bale had to publish it in a load of folio volumes. But I'm kind of curious as to why, when push came to shove, you guys decided this was a book project rather than a web project. The next question is about what you call your key findings. And you said there are a lot of changes in the 1631 edition. And I want to press you on that, because isn't that more or less familiar? I mean, I remember when I was working on brochures 20 years ago that I knew you had to look at the 1625 edition, you had to look at the 1631 edition, you had to see how the passages you were interested in had changed over time. And I was chiefly interested in a few paragraphs in the Prolegomena, so it wasn't that daunting a task. But I wonder if you could say a bit more about what it is you think your project has really learned about the changes to the text, because that sort of basic fact that it is a text for the history is familiar. The third question is an interpretive one. I mean, I first encountered Grotius when I was Richard Tutt student 30 years ago now, and the joke in that world was that the grand irony was that Grotius was celebrated at the Peace Palace when there was no kind of international aggression or imperialism that Grotius wasn't willing to justify. And we saw him as a kind of hired hack where you paid him and he spat out an opinion as to why whatever kind of aggression you were contemplating would be permissible. And from the point of view of your reception project, I wonder what your thoughts about that as general interpretation. Is Grotius an Irenic figure, or somebody who's plausibly presented as somebody who's seeking to build a more peaceful world? Or actually, does his audience recognize that what we have here is a very smart lawyer who is killing powerful, aggressive-minded imperialists what they want to hear?
Thanks, Chris. So I think the third and the second question is sort of related. So the actual reception is really varied. There's no doubt that rulers and rebels see in this what they want to see. what I think is most striking is how fluid the reception is and how much it varies. And I don't think there's necessarily a fixed idea of Grotius. There's a lot of emphasis on in the annotations, at least, because of course, again, one is the reading in the commentaries. So we're thinking Puffinor, if we're thinking all of these figures, and the type of commentaries that they make about Grotius, and then there's the type of comments that the annotators would make. And there was this discussion in the project as to, how do you balance sort of examining all of the commentators who then basically are seen as developing international law. How do you combine their comments with annotators' comments, preferences, and interests? So the interest of most annotators, the surprising interest was, what is the actual correct edition? So the 1631, the reason why that matters, because a lot of readers were obsessed with the fluidity of the text, how much changed, and were constantly trying to track down what had changed, where, and how to use that themselves, how to use what text were they using, basically. So that's where sort of, to try and see sort of question two, that sort of what was really striking was that in the absence of a sort of official version, readers were constantly trying to figure out, is this the right one? Is this the right text? And so in that sense, these changes made them sort of go crazy. But to go back to the question of Hyde Gann, of course, now with the post-colonial time, this has a new edge to the question. It's sort of like defender of the VOC, so why should we read him if he's just another imperialist? I don't want to save Grotius. I mean, I'm not interested in saving Grotius. I think, if anything, what's really interesting about this is that, again, to go back to this earlier point, it's a sort of success in spite of himself. This is someone who does not enjoy the benefits of being a hack. Many around him do. Most people around him do. He does not. And so this is sort of a history of a constant reinvention, where someone here sees some sort of source of authority, and it's tracking the really complicated story of, not just where that original move to say this is a figure of authority comes from, but how it keeps changing and how people do different things with it. Yeah, I mean, to me, he is a sort of an embittered man more than a sort of hired gun. But the two are compatible. And the first question on the database, yeah, I mean, we had a session with these German filmmakers who wanted to basically make this into a sort of online museum exhibit. So one idea was that if you've gone onto any museum catalog, you'll see that they are able to present a lot of information in a way that's very easily accessible. We ran into trouble with sort of copyright questions to do with the annotations, because the question was, what type of usable data can you actually upload to a database of that kind, publicly of that kind? Maybe we should have just written an email to the Bentham Project and sort of said urgent emergency help. But I think that was sort of part of it. And the other thing is that I do think in the context of the Max Planck Institute, there was a desire to sort of ennoble and formalize these findings as part of a traditional book that lawyers could use, and that was real and that was sort of official. And again, for me, the most interesting thing is to go back to one of your questions, is there's a lot to learn here from how we think about history, and we as a broad term, how lawyers think about history, how book historians think about history, how historians of political thought, there's multiple perspectives here at play, and we just try to contain as much of those insights as possible in that folder.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chris.
Yeah, please.
My question is more of a question of historiography, I guess. You mentioned the paradigm shift and the Grotian moment in the 70s. That's not really how history moves. Was that kind of a rejection of any like Hegelian dialectic or something like that? Or I guess Kuhn has a structure of scientific revolutions, and we kind of see that it does kind of change paradigm shifts. And I mean, post-Einstein relativity, was a huge paradigm shift that changed a lot of science and changed a lot of how we understood scientific history. So could that kind of go against what you said about Grotian movements not
Yeah, so it was Kuhn who coined the paradigm shift term, and this is against the background of Rand and sort of futurology in the 60s. You know, what's really interesting is that, I mean, metaphors sort of ground how we think about history and ourselves in the brain. You know, originally the self was the book, the self is now a computer, the self is now AI. So it's more about remaining alert about how we think about us and history. But I think there is a really important question as to, you know, how history actually changes. And it's one of the hardest things to do, because an author can change their mind on something and you can say, well, liberalism changed because this author thinks differently now. But if the experience on the ground of most people is not that, or if the people in power halfway across the world didn't think that, you know, it's very difficult to explain historical change even today, and that wouldn't be a problem if it wasn't for the fact that a lot of people have a stake in the idea that Grotius did start something, because that is a claim to historical change, upon which a lot rests.
So over here and then in the center. Go ahead.
Just on the last sentence, mistake. Grotius, I was at the H Academy just a few years ago, and a professor was still saying, starting the lectures with the Westphalian system and the whole sort of like shebang of what was aptly described as probably archaic or antiquated way of talking about Grotius and the Peace of Westphalia and this full time. So my question is, where does that come from? How does our understanding of Grotius shape sort of like who is vested in that storytelling, and why are people vested in that storytelling?
Yeah, I mean, sorry, Megan and I.
You go ahead and I'll come in later when we've gone through the questions we have.
Yeah, I mean, even Westphalia, I mean, that's something that we looked at. So there was a lot of debate within the project as to whether it was significant that after 1650, so the last edition we looked at was 1650. And one cutoff point for that was that the Leviathan appears in 51. And so that was one way to tell the funders that we had to stop at 50. But another point of that was to tackle the question of what was the relationship between the book and Westphalia. And certainly it's clear that the book, that edition sort of takes off after the peace signing, and it's more to navigate all of these treaties that have been signed more than as a rule book for the new international order. I don't know who else uses this sort of Westphalian. I know that there was a sort of Westphalian for the Middle East thing a couple of years ago, which I was surprised by at Cambridge, but I don't know. I mean, these myths structure different disciplinary fields, including international relations, international law. And what's funny about a project like this is that you see how slippery these foundations are, and it can seem like a very contrarian project. Perhaps in its as Sam I think this made me think, perhaps in its lack of clarity around its focus. And there was also a lot of debate within the project about whether to give this project a narrative, whether to give these findings a story. You know, so much of history is now just told through a simple narrative or one liner. What is the relationship between Grotius and Westphalia? That would have been fairly straightforward, but that was not the point of the book. We tried to create a manual that others could use, and there are of course choices within that you have to make.
As a kind of footnote to that, so on the 1650 cutoff point, so with Grotius dying in 1645 and 1647 being, as you pointed out before, a pirated edition, the 50 would be in a sense the first, as maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong about this, it's the first edition that's posthumous in which he didn't have a hand in bringing it to press, at least partially.
That's right.
So that has it has not just the pre-Leviathan point.
Yeah.
Please.
I was wondering about the engagement that the publisher had with Grotius's subsequent editions in the sense of the intellectual engagement. I've been reading recently some of Hobbes' correspondence. There's one very funny letter in which Elsevier tells Hobbes, so there are two editions of the Kiwe, and Elsevier tells Hobbes, your book should be sort of self-standing, autonomous. So you shouldn't refer to things that you are going to prove elsewhere. And so Hobbes, like the letter is funny because Hobbes explicitly acknowledges this contribution and changes everything to it is self-evidence that blah, 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 instead of I'm going to prove that in the. So I was wondering if there's a sort of like more intellectual engagement on the part of the publisher in these subsequent changes.
Yeah, it's a very good question. And again, there were different voices from the project. I mean, so the PI of the project, Mike Somers, was quite keen on emphasizing the fact that William Blau is a very erudite map maker, and the printing press was a sort of intellectual milieu where the debate was had. It's really difficult to tell beyond the more sort of savvy commercial practices whether there was a sort of intellectual investment in these debates. We couldn't really find a direct link. Well, we could find one of the nice findings was to do with the Athenaeum and these schools that emerged for students that aren't old enough to go to university in the Dutch Republic, which of course had really high levels of literacy. And these schools emerged right as Grotius is in exile, and many of the directors of these schools are friends of Grotius. And it turned out that a lot of the so we found a lot of prize copies, and these were copies donated to students of Grotius' books. And so then you have to think, you know, what is the relationship between this political exile who is having his texts being gifted to exemplary students who are presumably told to emulate his example. And so again, this is another finding which creates more questions than answers, but that's part of the project. So yes, the relationship between printing education and intellectual development is really interesting. Yeah.
I'm going to break in here with a couple of questions from online. I might pose them together. So Alison Firth asks, apropos annotators versus commentators, can you say something more about the tenor of the annotations? Is it a kind of yes exclamation mark, surely not, or is it a sort of more sophisticated adaptation and development? And a related question from Chris and John Smith, what's your view of the extent, if at all, to which Grotius was eager or willing to respond to critiques of his work, especially if they were substantive and extensive, and make changes accordingly? Are there some criticisms which bother him more than others, or does he generally ignore such matters? And he refers to his own experience of this in connection with Selden's response to Mare Liberum, but perhaps there's a broader answer.
Thank you. The tenor varies. I mean, so in response to Alison's question, the tenor varies hugely, and these German filmmakers asked us about the project. Well, one, they asked us basically, could we do a film where Grotius was placed in The Hague and we tried him for all the violations of international law that has ever been committed, and thus began a sort of 3-hour lecture that I had to give on what Grotius actually said. This is an enjoyable evening in Berlin. But one of their obsessions was sort of, you know, are there really impactful annotations? Does anyone say sort of fuck off or anything like that in the comments? And there were a couple of that, but a couple of those. But I think in general, the division here is between scholars who really might suffer from reading this book and from making annotations on it, and then people in extreme privilege just reading this, and book collectors. So that's a sort of dividing line most of the time, and often they'll overlap, that sort of thing. In terms of Grotius's response, I mean, there was that lovely edition, the 1642 edition to this debate with De Bie that he's having on sort of the divide between confessional and political authority in Europe. But yeah, absolutely. I mean, Chris is here. We have the whole question of the Socinian debate, this is sort of one of Grotius' big screw ups when he gets involved into this question of atonement and ransom and all this stuff. No, I mean he was a really restless figure, and yeah, absolutely. I mean he sort of responded to everything and everyone. Which again makes him a really difficult sort of thinker to study systematically, I think.
Can I just come in here because it flows almost immediately from that point about reactiveness and responsiveness. Coming back to one of the earlier questions about contestation, right? Whether we can study annotations to look not for kind of the coming together of a view of consensus, but for ongoing contestation. And connecting that to these questions about the place in the discipline and what work he's doing, we have to think at these multiple different levels that there might be kind of ongoing contestation around whether a particular point is correct or about the emphasis or something of that kind, but somehow the very engagement underwrites Grotius as the touchstone and the authority, and there is something of that kind happening at a meta level with a project like this. So on the one hand, you're trying to ask questions about what actually is Grotius's place and influence and push back and sort of unpack all these different moments of mythologization for different ends. But somehow the energy of funders, right, is always drawn back to this one figure as somehow a privileged touchstone or point of entry or index of the development of the discipline over time. In the same way that somehow argument at the level of detail ends up ratifying the individual as institution. When we think about change in international law, we often index that to particular institutional formation. So it's the founding of institutions. And actually, here in the conversation tonight, it's almost as though Grotius is an institution, right? It's a particular formation in which the discipline then lives.
Yeah, no, so to go back to, I want to link that to one of Sam's earlier questions about the relationship with the Spanish Empire. So I actually looked at how Grotius created a huge problem in international law by establishing this idea of odious debt. So I approached Grotius as one of the best readers of Spanish dynasticism and its problems. And in that sense, what Grotius is going to say is a debt should not be inherited in the process of succession if it has been incurred against the interest of a nation or without its consent. Now, this then creates a situation where there is a huge dispute as to what consent means and what the well-being means, and this is a problem that sort of remains unresolved to this day. There is sort of Aristotle mentions this, but Grotius is really the one who centers it in as a problem in international law, and is very much in response to the problem of Spanish tyranny and his definition of Spanish tyranny and the idea of revolution in his thought. And so I guess Grotius is an institution, and Grotius creates custom, but he also maybe creates, I think, it's not just a question of looking at solutions created by Grotius, but also problems created by Grotius, which live with us today. And that's more of a counterintuitive way of looking at these thinkers and custom.
This question of what, going back to both the last two good points, what is an institution, right? So, I mean, if you have an informal political theory, like if you read Jack Knight, right, an institution is just a rule. But if you read, say, Scanlon, if you read Analytic Political or whatever it is, if you read Scanlon, the paradigm case of an institution is kind of promise, is the paradigm case of an institution. But maybe there's something like the rule function of Grotius, which kind of operates in this way, but also maybe the promise function of Grotius.
See, that's interesting. I've written about the League of Nations as institution and picked up a little bit this ambiguity, but I was thinking about institution in a slightly more concrete or sociological sense, that it arranges people in particular offices and it invites in, sort of interpolates people to deal with particular questions, questions which might be posed in this way for the first time, problems which are raised, and something about the scale of it and the breadth of the reference and the fact that it's, for all we might say about the father of international law claim being overblown, he is recognized almost immediately in his lifetime by a whole range of other sophisticated thinkers as having something to say. So he's generalized almost immediately. I guess I'm thinking about it almost in terms of the kind of physical structure in which one then is moving constrains the way in which the conversation happens. Anyway, that's enough for me. I want to give others an opportunity to come in if they haven't asked any questions which are burning. And let me just check that there's no one else that I've scouted. Oh yeah, there's a couple more online. No, that's Alison, and I think we've seen those. Any final questions or thoughts? Do you want to say anything in closing it?
No, thank you all for coming. It may seem like an impenetrable book, but if the question is international in crisis, which seems to be the sort of the cheap way of thinking about the problem of the world today, I'm sorry to say that we need history. we need more of this stuff. We need to go back and look at what these texts that must be more than an atavistic symbol of something we hope for actually said. And we need to actually go back to the history out of which this comes out. And so and within that we will find a repertoire of ideas that we have probably forgotten, and which may actually assist us today. I think there's a problem with newness and we move towards newness, whereas actually I think rummaging through history might yield solutions that we can't imagine today.
Many thanks to Ed and Sam and to all of you for coming and for your questions, which I personally found very generative. It was not their key addressee. And we hope to see many of you in various seminars in the year to come. Thanks.